there, my name is Brady and I'm from Sparrow Quilt Company. If you are anything like me and you hate binding, then you are going to love this tutorial on how to do quick and easy machine binding. Today I'm going to bind this cute little quilt that Landon made, and I'm going to start by auditioning a couple of different fabrics that we have pre-chosen. So I have these three choices here. They're all three present in the quilt, so any of them would be a good choice. But we are just going to start by laying out a little bit and seeing how it looks flipped over the edge of the quilt. I'm going to use this side that has lots of colors so that I can get a good picture of how it looks beside all those colors. And I'm trying to make it nice and slim like a binding actually would be. So I think that black looks pretty good. It's nice and neutral and it works with all the colors. So let's have a look at the cream now. And this is the background fabric that Landon used in the quilt, so it definitely matches. Now I do like that a lot as well. My only concern is that it's maybe going to get dirty easily. I do know that Landon has a couple of cats and a puppy dog, so it's possible that this lighter colored binding might get stained or marked up, although I do think it is a good matching choice. Going the wrong way with that one. Last, we've got this nice blue. And I do like that one too, but I think the black might be a better choice. What do you think, Landon? We got Landon behind the scenes and she agrees, black is the choice. So let's go ahead and cut our strips for this binding. Now, I like to cut my binding really nice and thin, and that isn't how everybody likes their binding. I typically cut mine at about 2 inches, but if you like a fatter binding, then you're going to cut it at 2 1/4 or 2 1/2. So that'll be your personal preference. If you like to have a bit more room in your binding, then cut it wider. I like mine to be really tight and wrapped around, kind of small. It really only looks like about 1/4 inch of binding on the front of the quilt. So that's why I go with 2 inches. I'm going to set my ruler for a 2-inch width. And this little quilt, I think, was 33 by 40. So we have to go 33 plus 40 times 2, and that gives us the full measurement of the length around the total quilt. So we are looking for about 140 inches of continuous binding. Each of our strips of fabric is 44 inches wide. Because it takes a couple of inches to join them, I always factor this to be about 40 inches. And then I know that I'll have a little bit of play there with my numbers. So if I need 140 inches of binding, 140 divided by 40, I'm going to cut 4 strips. And then I'll have 160 inches of binding, and that'll give me plenty of room to do all my joins and not run out of binding fabric. Here is 2. And 3. And 4. All right. So now we're just going to switch up the camera angle so that you can get a good view of how we pin our pieces together. So now I'm ready to join my binding strips, and I like to use my cutting mat to make sure that I'm joining them nice and square to one another. I've laid out my first one on the horizontal line, and I'm going to bring my second strip over, and I'm going to lay it at a 90-degree angle to my first one. And I am just lining it up with one of my vertical lines. Now I'm going to have to sew from this corner to this corner, so I'm going to put my pins in this way, and I usually use 2 of them. And then I'm going to draw a line for myself from corner to corner so I know exactly where to sew. There we go. So now I'm going to continue to join my binding strips in that way until I have all 4 pinned together. So I'll take the end of this one next, and now this one will go on the horizontal, and my next one will be on the vertical. I'm not too worried about those ends hanging off because I cut plenty of binding strips. I know that I've got a little bit of room to allow for that excess fabric to hang off the ends like that. I'll turn it this way, hopefully you can see a little better. Line that up from corner to corner. And draw my line to sew on. Whoops. There we go. So I'll continue joining these, and then we'll head over to the sewing machine and we'll stitch those together. All right, so now I am going to join all my binding strips by sewing on that blue marking line that I've given myself. And just take your time when you're sewing over pins. You don't want to hit those pins and have a needle break. And you can chain piece these. You don't have to sever your thread in between. Saves you a little bit of thread if you just continue to sew with the chain rather than severing in between. Good. All right. So I'm going to pull all these pins, and then next I'm going to trim away those outer edges that I've just sewn. And for this we want to trim so that we've got about a 1/4 inch outside of that seam. And I'm just kind of eyeballing that. It doesn't need to be perfect. And there's one more in my pile here somewhere. There's the 3rd one there. Okay, now I'm just going to set up my pressing area, and I'll show you how I prepare this for stitching it onto the quilt. Now I am ready to press my binding strips in half so that they are ready to be attached to the quilt. And how I go about doing that is I fold my binding strip with the wrong sides of fabric together so that the outside is all right side of fabric, and I'm just going to press the beginning, maybe about the first 6 to 8 inches, and I'm lining up those raw edges as best I can. And then I'm going to use what's called a sasher tool, and it's this little orange tool with 2 slots in it, and I am going to weave it in one slot and out the other, And then I'm going to be able to use this to make my binding folding part a little bit faster. I will just push it along with my iron and it will fold the fabric for me, so that makes things a little bit easier. As I go along, I'm going to wind my binding onto this binding baby, and it will keep my 160 inches of binding under control for me so that I don't have to worry about it getting all over the place. I'm going to insert that into the little slot on the binding baby, and I just start winding it on there as I go. When I come to a join, I'm going to press that seam open, and that will reduce the bulk in my binding. And then I will just carry on with the pressing it in half, and you can see how easily that little tool just shuffles along for me, folding the fabric. It also protects my fingers from the heat, as the fabric can get pretty hot. So inch length as I go along, I just continue to wind it on to my binding baby. And once I've got the entire length folded in half, we'll go ahead and attach it onto the quilt. Okay, now we are ready to attach our binding to the quilt. Because I am doing my binding by machine 100%, I am attaching the binding on the back side of the quilt. If you would prefer to hand stitch your binding onto the back, then you are going to stitch your binding onto the front of the quilt and then bring it around to the back and hand stitch, because I want my binding to be really secure, and I don't want to invest the time in hand binding. I'm doing it totally by machine. So I'm going to start by leaving myself a tail of about 10 to 12 inches, and I am going to be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. I've also put on the extension table onto my sewing machine. It helps support the quilt a little bit more, and then I'm not pulling and fighting the drag of the weight of the quilt. You can see I've got my binding baby up here on the thread spool, and I'll just continue to pull the binding off of there as I attach it onto the quilt. So we're going to begin sewing, and I always do a little bit of a back stitch at the beginning. This is one of the only places where I do back stitch. One of the most important parts of the binding is the corners, so I really want to make sure that you see that. My tip for corners is to stop sewing a 1/4 inch before the corner, and then I'm going to turn the project and sew on a 45-degree angle straight out the corner. So I'll show you that now. Now my foot has a marking on the foot itself that is a 1/4 inch in front of the needle, so I can see when the edge of my quilt is lined up with that 1/4 inch marking, I know that's where it's time to stop. I'm going to raise my foot, my needle is down, and I'm going to rotate my project slightly until I can see the corner of the quilt pointing out at me at the same point as the needle. I'm going to drop this back down, and I'm going to sew right off the corner of the quilt. So I'm hoping you can see that, how I sewed down the edge with the 1/4 inch seam, and then you can see where I turned the project and stitched straight off the corner. Okay, so now what we need to do is we're going to take the binding and we're going to fold it away from the project, straight up away from the project. And I'm going to kind of finger crease that fold with my fingernails. I want it to fold quite precisely. Now I'm going to hold that fold that I've just created, and I'm going to fold the binding back so that it's now going down the new side of the quilt that I'm about to stitch on. I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm going to rotate the whole project so that now I can start stitching down this second side. You're going to want to raise your needle because we're not starting right at the top. We're going to start a 1/4 inch down. Like the 1/4 inch marking in front of the needle, my foot also has a 1/4 inch marking behind the needle. That's where I want to line up this top edge of the quilt, so then I know that my needle is a 1/4 inch down. I'm going to drop my needle there, and I'm going to start sewing down this edge. Good. I will complete the stitching of the binding onto the back of the quilt, and then I'm going to show you how to join the 2 strips once I've got it all attached. All right, so we're coming up to the final corner. I thought it can't hurt for you to have another look at how I do that. I am just going to keep sewing with my 1/4 inch seam. And I am stopping a 1/4 inch before the end, and then I'm going to turn the project and sew right off the corner. Pull the project away from the needle for a moment. Okay, so you're going to take the binding and fold it away from the project, okay, and crease that well with your fingers. Then you're going to fold it back towards the project again, keeping this top fold lined up with that outer edge of the quilt. All right, then we're going to take this and put it back under the machine, and this time we're going to start sewing a 1/4 inch late. So when I drop my needle's actually going to be lined up with my previous stitching line that was just done on that horizontal plane there. I'll drop my needle and start sewing down this edge. Now I want to stop about 12 inches from where I started, and I don't get out the ruler and measure this, I just kind of eyeball it. So I've kind of picked this spot right here is where I'm going to stop. And I do, 2 or 3 back stitches there. And we're going to pull this away from the machine, and I'll show you how I'm going to join those 2 ends so that I can finish sewing this on to the surface of the quilt. You're going to lay things out so that they're flat in front of you, and you want to bring both of these tails so that they meet each other at about the center point, and you're just going to fold it back onto itself so that the 2 edges that are touching are folded back. Just the right amount of binding on my baby there. Now at this point, I don't actually let them touch. I will keep about 1/8 of an inch of space between them, and I just find that that allows for me to have a nice perfect join. If I have them touching, I usually end up with a little bit of lump in my binding, and no one likes lumpy binding. So if you leave just 1/8 of an inch space between those 2 folded edges, you're going to get just good results. I like to finger crease those quite well, and in addition to that, I'll also bring a piece of chalk over, and I'm going to mark this top edge and the side folded edge. I'm creating a crosshair of sorts, and you'll see in a minute how this helps me. And you just want to be able to see it, so use a chalk or a marking pen that has some good contrast from your binding fabric. Now I'm going to take these, I just kind of stick my finger here and I fold it onto itself. I want to narrow the gap between those two, between the two endings where the sewing stopped, and I'm going to pin that so that it stays together for me. Now what I'm going to do is very similar to the joins that we did at the beginning when we were joining all our binding strips together. I'm going to bring this left side and I'm going to open it up and lay it out flat. And you can see the crosshairs marked on the binding. Okay, so this piece coming from the left is horizontal. Now this piece coming from the right, I'm also going to open it up and it is going to go vertically on top of the other piece of binding. And I'm looking for my crosshair that I've already marked, and I'm going to lay it out on top of the other crosshair. I'm going to make sure that it's open. And I'm now going to put a pin through this way, and I'm going to sew across those binding strips on that 45-degree angle. If you want to mark that with a pen, you can. I usually just wing it. So we'll stitch across those two strips to join them. Take your time over that pin. And there we go. Before I cut these extra tails off, I'm going to take out this pin and make sure that it fits. Because once I've cut them, there's no going back from that. So there I can see that it fits just right. Now I feel comfortable cutting off those extra pieces. And I can finish attaching the binding onto the back side of the quilt. I don't worry too much about the exact 1/4 inch here. I just use a pair of scissors and kind of eyeball it. That 1/4 inch seam will be hidden inside my binding, and no one's going to know if that was bang on or not. I do like to take that and kind of finger press it open. It does reduce the bulk, but if you forget to do that, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. So now we will finish sewing this on to the back, and then I will see you again when I'm going to stitch it onto the front side. All right, so we have got the binding fully attached on the back side. Now I'm at the point where I'm going to bring it around to the front, and I'm going to top stitch it down into place, and then we will be done. So I'm going to bring it around, and a good way to hold things in place are these cute little clips. They go by many different names: wonder clips, mini clips, binding clips, clips of any sort. You can see it's just a little like alligator type clip. It is quite strong. It's going to really hold things in place for you. The top of it has kind of a curve, the bottom is flat, so I'm going to put the flat side on the bottom. And I'm going to use those just to help me keep things in place, because when we're attaching binding, it feels like we could use as many arms as possible. So I'll place a few of those along the edge. And I'll just remove them as I approach them. These ones I cannot sew over. They are not like pins. You could pin around the whole outer edge. It doesn't lay as flat as when you use these type of clips because the pin goes in and out, so it kind of causes this dimpling. But if pins is all that you've got, then use it. Use it. All right, so I'm just going to start right here above my first clip, and I'm starting close to a corner because that's what I want to show you is the corner. I am lining up so that I'm just a hair inside my folded edge of my binding, and you can see here I've kind of got the folded edge almost lined up with the outer edge of my foot there, so my stitching line will be less than an eighth, more like a 16th just inside of the edge of my binding. So you can see here, hopefully really well, just how close I am to that edge. I'm going to drop my needle here to kind of keep my place, and this first clip I'm going to pull it out of the way, and I'm just going to start sewing down. I am going to do a little bit of a back stitch here. I do want this to be nice and secure. And we'll just keep pulling those clips as we make our way along. Okay, so I'm going to keep sewing down this edge until I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge, just like we did when we were attaching it. And I'll just slow right down so that I get it quite precise. Now I've stopped a 1/4 inch from the edge of my quilt. Now I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to back stitch 10 stitches. 8, 9, 10, and I stop with my needle down. I want everything to stay in place. What I need to do now is this lip of binding that's going to attach on this horizontal side, I'm going to fold it up into place, and then I'm going to stitch back down towards it until I can just catch the first bit of it. And sometimes you'll find it beneficial to maybe use a pin right in this corner to create that nice crisp fold and make sure that this stays really accurate. Okay, I'm just going to kind of pin that for a second, and I'm going to get my first clip on this side in place. Now I'm going to hold this with my pin, and I'm going to start stitching towards my corner again. And just go nice and slow because you got a pin in there, or maybe you don't, but I find it's the best way to hold things in place. Now that stitch is in the new section of the binding, so I'm going to pull my pin out of there, and it's time to raise the presser foot, and we're going to rotate the whole project so that now we can stitch down this side of the quilt. Before I begin, I'm going to put a few more clips in place to act as my extra hands, and I'm going to stitch down about 5 stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch. I really like to make sure my corners are good and secure because of the way that fabric is folded in there. It's quite bulky, and we want to make sure that everything stays where we've put it. So come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do one more, and we'll go back 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can proceed down this side. All right, so you're going to continue like that around the whole top edge of the quilt, and before you know it, your binding will be complete. Good luck with your machine binding.